Declan, thank you for that nice introduction. I haven't had any offers on the transfer fee, but maybe something we could talk about. I'd also like to thank Professor Paddy Bro sincerely for the invitation to speak with you this afternoon. I'm extremely honoured to join this list of distinguished Irish surgeons who've given this lecture before me, some of whom are in the audience here today. And Declan has given you a taste of Robert Smith and his contribution to surgery, and I will return to him a little later on. Today, I'd like to return to the subject of surgical education, the topic, but hopefully not the lecture, that my colleague Oscar Traynor addressed here more than a decade ago. And it's easy to get lost in the science and the technology, the competencies and the pedagogy, assessments and outcomes. So let's begin in Declan McGee's home county of Fermanagh, on the beautiful island of Devonish in Lough Erne. And on that island was the monastery of St. Maileys. Ireland has a long tradition of valuing knowledge, education and learning, and it goes back almost 2 millennia to the early days of the Christian Church. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Irish monasteries like this were among the few centres that preserved education and learning across Europe, largely because we were so far away from the rest of Europe. For nearly 1,000 years, the monks lived mostly in peace. And while they've been characterised as preserving knowledge and copying manuscripts using the information technology of the day, the quill, ink and parchment, there was a huge emphasis on prayer and on time for reflection. And we've heard a lot about the importance of reflection today already. The information they gathered wasn't exclusively spiritual, but they also concerned themselves with the science of crop and animal husbandry. They determined how to build structures that have lasted to this day and how to care for the sick and injured. The monks recognised that information that might be stored then in a book or now on an iPad or a smartphone, but that learning must be forged in the fire of experience and quenched in the waters of reflection. This tempering of knowledge and how we can use information technology to facilitate this process is something I will come back to shortly. It's a crucially important part of the education of a surgeon that they reflect on their experience and that this reflection is properly informed. The importance of bedside clinical experience was the cornerstone of the first generation of modern medical educators who emerged in Dublin, as elsewhere in Europe, in the 18th and early 19th century. Dublin at that time was the home of leading clinical innovators, including surgeons such as Robert Smith and Collis and Bennett, and even physicians such as Corrigan, Graves and Stokes. And collectively, in what became known as the Dublin School of Medicine, they stressed the importance of observation and the application of theoretical knowledge to experience. Marvellous though it was at the time, I grew up and came of age as a surgeon in Ireland with an educational model that had hardly changed in 100 years. But we all know that the 19th century model of training isn't fit for the purpose of delivering 21st century surgeons. In terms of how we approach the use of information technology in the provision of surgical education, I think the report of the Global Commission for the Education of Health Professionals for the 21st Century, published a few years ago in The Lancet, is a good starting point. The report calls for competency-based curricula, creative use of information technology, transformative learning and interprofessional teamwork, as well as a systems approach to institutional reforms. So what does all that mean? In Ireland, our regulatory body has adopted 8 domains of competency, similar to the CanMeds and to the frameworks used here in the UK by the GMC. For the purposes of surgical training, Oscar Traynor has told you all before that we've broken these down into 3 areas: scholarship or knowledge, technical skills including clinical skills, and human factors, a number of which competencies are covered by this umbrella. So in terms of scholarship, the college invested a huge amount of effort and a considerable amount of money developing a standalone, internet-based, interactive, media-rich e-learning tool, which we called BEST, from electronic basic surgical training. And at the same time, the Edinburgh and London colleges devoted similar resources to developing largely similar products. BEST is a nice way to explain clinical concepts, but we are social learners. More than most, surgeons like to see and do rather than read and rehearse. And for everyone, information becomes synthesized into understanding much more effectively when we discuss, analyse and explain. That's why we're here at this meeting. And that's why the medieval monks in Ireland retreated to islands, whether they were in Lough Erne or in Skellig Michael in the stormy Atlantic off the coast of Kerry. It wasn't to get away from others. They lived in close-knit communities, but to get away from distractions and ensure that they had time for contemplation and reflection. Busy performance-focused clinics with lean staffing ratios, on-call rosters, and working time restrictions are a challenging place to find time for reflection and unhurried discussion. We used to gather our trainees into the college building once a week, but we found that this wasted a lot of time in travelling and was impossible to coordinate with those other competing attractions. So in 2003, I was asked to establish an online community of surgical trainees called School for Surgeons. And this is delivered using Moodle, which is an open source educational content management system, to deliver weekly cases which trainees could discuss in small peer groups in a bulletin board format at a time that's convenient to them, which is usually at home late at night. We've shown that working in peer groups and showing trainees how they're performing versus their peers is extremely valuable in promoting their engagement with this type of learning. In addition to case studies, we use this format for the discussion of journal articles and run a series of standalone structured courses on evidence-based clinical practice. We also provide standard courses that are required for compliance with regulators or other authorities, such as those on hand hygiene and the prevention of surgical site infections. And Seamus McHugh, now an SPR in our programme, did his MD thesis and has published some nice work on the value of e-learning in contributing to behaviour change. We've been doing this now for over 10 years and the technology has moved on. Almost all of our trainees now have smartphones. There's 1.3 million smartphones in Ireland. A poster outside from the Scottish Surgical Research Group shows that 92% of surgical trainees in Scotland have a mobile phone, and I presume it's similar elsewhere in the UK. So we now deliver our School for Surgeons in a smartphone-friendly format. And a new mobile app is just about to go live for the new intake of surgical trainees in July. And in addition to accessing case studies, we've included access to just-in-time learning resources, such as a series of short videos made by a former president of our college, Professor Frank Keane, on how to do minor operative procedures. With the recent launch of Google Glass, we finally have off-the-shelf technology that will allow a surgeon to access visual information, maybe anatomy schemas, maybe radiological images, maybe a colleague on Skype who can look in and advise while a surgeon actually does the operation. It's voice-operated, affordable, and coming to a head or an operating theatre near you very shortly. It's been clearly shown in endoscopic surgery that those trained to proficiency in the virtual environment operate more quickly and with less errors than those who move directly to the operating theatre. More recently, we've confirmed that this also occurs in open surgery using a saphenofemoral ligation model. Hazem Messino published this in the Journal of this association just last year. And as the range and quality of simulators increases while prices fall, I think it's becoming more and more difficult to justify trainees who are without virtual experience undertaking their first procedure in a patient. So we do bring our trainees into the simulation lab and into this new building, we hope, which will be finished in 2016. Or we bring our mobile skills unit to them. And they do this 4 to 6 times per year to allow them learn and develop their technical skills in a simulated environment. We've developed and continue to develop online supporting material that prepares our trainees for the simulation lab, ensuring that the relatively expensive time in the lab can be used effectively. They can also review this material afterwards or refer to it for some just-in-time training immediately before they undertake a procedure. In July of this year, our Year 1 trainees will each come in for a 5-day intensive boot camp before they start on their clinical posts, and they will have access to the supporting material via their smartphone app afterwards. In our training programme, the remaining areas of clinical competence are gathered under the umbrella of human factors. And this is one area where you might expect ICT systems to be of least value. We provide 4 days per year of human factors training. This involves trainees working in groups, using role play and other exercises to develop and allow us to assess their human factors skills. We also deliver supporting material online using School for Surgeons, making sure that the time available in class is used as effectively as possible. We adopted the FHI logbook, the e-logbook, as mandatory for all our surgical trainees in 2007, so that we could use the technology to accurately quantify operative experience, having tried for years with paper logbooks and other versions of electronic logbooks with no success. We found that most basic surgical trainees get to do less operating than their trainers thought they were giving to them, or that they told us they were giving to them, less operating time than we thought they should, and certainly less operating time than the trainees thought that they should. We presented our findings at this association the last time it was in Glasgow and published this a few years ago, and I see similar findings in a poster from the group in St. George's on display outside today. Our conclusion then was that access to appropriate operative experience should be a key performance indicator for training posts. And we're currently working on the Irish e-logbook dataset to produce a training profile that we will feed into a process that we've called Qualitrain. Qualitrain will be used for the purpose of accrediting training posts. And this isn't just a big data issue, of course, it's also a political issue, and it's proving a little more difficult than we had originally hoped, but the work on this goes on. You've noticed that I haven't referred to Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, LinkedIn, or the plethora of other open social media systems that have exploded onto the internet over the past 10 years or so. We do tweet, but there are some areas of controversy in the use of these media, including some issues raised by the GMC guidelines last week, and indeed some issues discussed at a nice session here yesterday morning. The Moodle platform we use is actually based on a social constructivist model of education, but it's a closed system. Users must be registered with us, and the content is served from our own ICT department. And we've found this approach preferable to date for our purposes. There are some interesting developments in the area of online learning that may yet challenge our approach, though. In 2003, MIT made the online content of 500 of their courses freely available on the internet in their open courseware program, and now they provide open access to the content of 2,000 courses. Increasingly, other large, mainly US, but not exclusively US, educational providers now offer free enrollment and certification for those who actively participate in massive open online courses. In terms of producing content, crowdsourcing is another new technique being used, among others, by an Irish company, iHeed, which is led by a Cork GP, Dr. Tom O'Callaghan. iHeed produce high-quality, health-related educational material aimed at the general public in the developing world, and this content is then made freely available. iHeed hope that this will allow NGOs working in development to free up the resources and their time to focus on the audience and the learners, rather than on producing content which is not necessarily in their area of expertise. Even in the case of surgical education, there's a growing mass of material just a Google away. It's a very variable quality, though, and there's more chaff than wheat being added over time. We've looked systematically at the change in the quality of information available to patients over the internet. Using a standardized scoring system, we compared 1999, which is in the pre-Google era, with 2004. And the quality of the information available was variable, and this quality was actually declining over time. We've just completed a review of patient information and common orthopedic procedures, and once again, the quality is variable. I trained as a vascular surgeon when endovascular surgery was in its infancy, but it now comprises up to 80% of my surgical workload. And Adam explained this morning how that's likely to become 100% before much longer. We can't train surgeons for procedures or even provide them with skills that don't yet exist. But we can and must ensure that they're equipped to update their knowledge and develop these required new skills. Surgeons always needed to know how to do this, but there are important differences in how we access the information in the era of embedded technology like smartphones, tablets, or Google Glass. Tom Brown, an educationalist from the University of Pretoria, has described this as navigationism and has put it forward as the new paradigm for education. He speaks eloquently and he writes accessibly on this new pedagogic model as we move from E to M learning. In relation to our programmes, I've left research aside, not because I don't think it's important, but because it's been covered so well both in the sessions before and indeed the GMC session just after this in this room. But I want to turn to another area. In 2007, our then President, Professor Jerry O'Sullivan, and a former deliverer of the Robert Smith Lecture, was approached by a lifelong friend of his, a graduate and fellow of our college, Professor Kraiker Ertzen-Gatzian, who's the man you see on the extreme left. Kraiker wanted to seek his support for the new College of Surgeons of East, Central and Southern Africa. The college covers then 9, now 10 countries in the region, most of which are among the poorest in the world in terms of national income. Since then, we've been working collaboratively with COSEXA in a programme supported by our college and to the tune of almost €2 million in Irish aid money. Mr. McGee, our Vice President representing the college here today, has been a tireless advocate for this programme. As part of that collaboration, we undertook a workforce analysis and found that there are about 4 or 5 surgeons per million population in this region, and that's less than 10% of the figure for Ireland or the UK. Few of these work in hospitals that have anything like the level of equipment we're used to at home. And in such an environment, it's challenging to deliver any surgical care, never mind trying to train the next generation of surgeons, in a vast area much bigger than Western Europe. Surgery accounts for at least 11% of the global disease burden, but has been seen by many development agencies as a luxury that sub-Saharan Africa simply couldn't afford. However, Caris Grimes, an SPR who's speaking in the international development session immediately after this, has elegantly shown that simple surgery such as hernia repair is more cost-effective, as measured by disability life year gained, than initiatives such as measles vaccination, oral rehydration therapy, or the provision of insecticide-impregnated mosquito nets. And yet the value of these initiatives is taken for granted. I know I'm preaching to the converted here. This association in particularly has worked with COSEXA and other African partners for many years, and currently under the leadership of Bob Lane and the new chairman of the International Development Committee, the Association of Surgeons has provided high-quality surgical training courses, scholarships to promising young trainees from those regions, and many other initiatives. And other Royal Colleges, particularly Edinburgh, have also supported COSEXA and its predecessor, the Association of Surgeons of East Africa. In our programme, we focus less on delivering the training than in supporting the college activities and its training faculty. We've provided logistic support and quality assurance for the membership and fellowship exams, and during this time, the numbers taking and passing the fellowship exam has grown threefold, but there's still a long way to go. We've sent out our examining faculty to Africa as external examiners and brought COSEXA faculty to Ireland to involve them in our membership exam. We've helped adapt our e-learning model to create COSEXA's own e-learning platform, schoolforsurgeons.net, and together have built a library of culturally appropriate case discussions. Initially, this included the provision of IT labs, nearly 30 of which we've equipped to date, and providing internet access. But access to broadband internet now has dramatically improved in recent years, at least in the cities, and again, the availability of smartphones and tablets has become much more widespread. Perhaps the most important part of our collaboration has been growing COSEXA's organisational capacity. This has included providing faculty development courses, developing an online database of trainees, members and fellows, and we're currently in the process of working with COSEXA to support their recruitment of a full-time CEO who should be in place by the end of the summer. More recently, we've been working in 2 centres in Zimbabwe on a programme of training of medical officers in the basics of surgical care called ZEST. Our programme is now the biggest single development programme focused on surgery in sub-Saharan Africa. Working with inspirational surgeons and trainees in Africa to help develop their college and improve surgical care in the region has been one of the most rewarding aspects of my professional life. I believe our experience to date is just the foundation of work our college and others will continue to do for many years into the future. And I encourage you all to attend the International Development Meeting after this, And if you haven't done so, to look at how you might involve yourself in this kind of activity using well-developed college and association structures. Building a future in the face of similar tremendous adversity was the challenge that faced Robert Smith in 1847. The Irish potato famine was at its height when he was appointed to the Foundation Chair of Surgery in Trinity College Dublin in 1847. The economy and the population were in free fall. By 1851, just 4 years later, there were 1 million dead of starvation and disease, and another 1 million had been lost to emigration. Robert Smith died in 1873, by which time the population of Ireland had fallen by almost 40% in just 30 years. And to this day, it still hasn't recovered to pre-famine levels, while, for example, the population of the UK has increased threefold in the same time. Yet 1847 was also an exciting time to be appointed an academic surgeon. In November of the previous year, Bigelow published an account of 4 cases of surgery under ether anaesthesia in the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal. Before the end of 1846, the first surgical anaesthetic with ether was administered in England by William Squire during surgery by Robert Liston, and the following year, a Dublin surgeon, John MacDonald, administered the first ether anaesthetic in Ireland in the Richmond Hospital. Robert Smith was one of the leaders of a relatively small community of surgeons who gathered together in the college building on fashionable St. Stephen's Green in the heart of Georgian Dublin. He contributed to the knowledge base of surgery, not least his work on the eponymous fracture and on neurofibromas. He contributed to teaching the next generation of doctors and surgeons, and perhaps most importantly, he and they provided the thought leadership that we still need today. Perhaps even more than we did then, and not just in surgery, but in healthcare generally. The never-ending process of healthcare reform feels like it is gathering pace, but has no direction. In the UK, the fundamental principles of the NHS are under severe scrutiny. In Ireland, almost half of our population are covered by private health insurance, and more than half of all surgical procedures, typically those procedures best suited to training, are now performed in the private sector, where there are virtually no surgical trainees. In the face of challenges such as this, Richard Horton, in an editorial in The Lancet just a few years ago, wrote that surgeons as patients' advocates should be active and united in drawing attention to inadequacies as part of an agenda of reform that promotes professionalism and leadership. He then went on to say, but surgeons are largely absent from the debate. The profession is visibly absent from higher positions in healthcare. Is this because surgery is too fragmented into subspecialties, too introspective, or just too disinterested? Now, Richard Horton is known for adopting provocative positions, and perhaps challenging statements like this bring in more letters and get better coverage in the newspapers. And he could, of course, simply be wrong. In fact, I think he is wrong. Our college is distinguished in producing ministers for health in at least 3 countries. Lord Darcy, former Minister for Health in Tony Blair's government, is a graduate and fellow of our college, and indeed formerly gave this Robert Smith lecture. The previous Minister for Health in Bahrain, Dr. Hafad, and Dr. James Riley, our current Minister for Health, are also graduates of the college. And of course, there are many other surgeons who've contributed to public life, both in Ireland and on this side of the Irish Sea. But perhaps there's a grain of truth in Horton's allegations. There is at least a risk that in our focus on competency-based training, we're failing to encourage our trainees to involve themselves in the difficult areas of medical politics and real-world politics, either within or outside the system, and indeed, to a degree, in healthcare management. Surgeons bring a perspective to decision-making in these areas from which everyone benefits. We need to ensure that the drive towards a competency-based training system does not place a boundary around what our trainees are expected to achieve. Rather than the ceiling, competency-based progression is the floor on which to build imaginative and innovative training systems and surgical careers, and it's something to think about for the future at least. Thank you.